A recent Gallup poll says 62% of the US adult working population wants to be their own boss. And I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean they want to drive for Uber and DoorDash. That's nearly 100 million people, a huge number, and far greater than the number of people who actually end up starting or buying a small business. That number is more like 300,000 to 400,000 per year. So only about 4 out of every 1,000 people who dream of owning a business actually do something about it. So what gives? I was recently talking with one of these aspiring owners, and she told me she didn't even know where to start. She kept coming back to this idea that the real issue was confidence. She had never owned a business. She didn't have a specific idea. She didn't know who to talk to. And the more she thought about everything she'd need to figure out, the more overwhelmed she felt. As she was describing it, I realized how familiar it sounded. Not because I hadn't been confident in the past, but because I'd been in plenty of situations where I didn't yet know enough to act responsibly. That conversation reminded me of a recent moment where I felt exactly the same way. I was listening to this podcast about Les Schwab. If you're not familiar with who he is, he built a chain of tire stores into a multi-billion-dollar business. And the podcast host was talking about how Schwab used these incentives to get his team to think and act like owners. And I had that reaction I've learned to pay attention to, that feeling that this is important. This is something my business needs. The idea was exciting. The idea of everyone in the company understanding how what they do creates value and knowing that they actually benefit when the company wins. And at the same time, it was completely overwhelming. I mean, I've been around long enough to know that incentives can create as many problems as they solve. So I immediately started spinning about all the ways this could go wrong. An incentive plan that bleeds cash, incentives turning into entitlement instead of ownership, a team that didn't have the context or the tools to actually connect their work to the outcome. All that is to say, I felt immediately this was far more complex than just, let's implement a profit-sharing plan. I knew I needed to be thoughtful, and yet I didn't yet know enough to even think about how to act responsibly. And that's when I remembered I already had a process for this kind of situation, a way to take something complex and unfamiliar and turn it into a working plan that I can feel confident enough to act on. So I shared that process with this woman, and she found it helpful, enough so that I thought maybe it might be useful to share it more broadly. I call this my building conviction process. But before I walk you through it, I want to give you one important caveat. I only use this process for big, complex, high-stakes decisions. Because if something is low stakes or easy to undo, I find it's usually just better to start trying things and learn as you go. But if I'm confronting a decision, something that's hard to walk back from, then sometimes the opposite of that problem shows up. I can get caught up in this endless research trying to find 100% certainty. It can feel productive, but usually it's just procrastination. It's procrastinating from doing the hard work of taking the real action, like talking to people and making decisions that are going to have implications. So here's how my process works. Step 1, get clear. I start by getting clear on what I'm actually trying to figure out, not the entire universe of the problem, just like the main real question in front of me. In my case, in the situation I was thinking of, it wasn't how do I design an incentive plan? It was how do I create a culture of ownership? Now, incentives were part of that, but I knew they weren't the whole thing. Step 2, set a deadline and tie it to an action. I already shared how my desire for certainty can lead to procrastination, so I find it helps me to put a stake in the ground of when I'm going to take a meaningful action. Now, to set this deadline, I find it helpful to estimate how long it'll take me to reach about 80% clarity. That's enough that I'd feel comfortable walking a smart person through my thinking without feeling embarrassed about it. And in this case, I decided to give myself 3 months, and I actually set a meeting at the end of the 3 months to present my plan to my business partner and get his feedback. All right, step 3. This is when I gather inputs. At this point, I start gathering anything that might shed light on the problem. So we're talking books, podcasts, articles, interviews, videos, newsletters. I'm not looking for some perfect silver bullet answer. I'm just looking for a range, enough different perspectives that I'll be able to start seeing the patterns. Because I'm not really trying to collect tactics as much as I'm trying to understand principles. Because the tactics can change, some of them will work and don't work, but the principles, those won't change. And once I'm clear on what those are, I can find a lot of different ways that feel right to me to act on. And when it comes to choosing what to consume, I just follow my curiosity. And I am willing to move on quickly from anything that isn't useful because my perspective is the goal is learning, not building a checklist of finished books. Step 4, write it out. This is where I force myself to get clear on my thinking. And I find it's helpful to constantly be asking myself 3 questions as I'm reading, listening, and watching. One is, what do I believe? 2 is where do I see the opportunity? And 3 is how would I move forward if I decided to act? Now, taking what I'm learning and writing those down, taking these loose ideas and turning them into something concrete creates a working document for me that I can then evolve as I learn more. And finally, step 5, I pressure test it. For me, I share my thinking with people who have expertise. In my example, that included an entrepreneur who had implemented an employee stock ownership plan, a coach from the Great Game of Business, which is a framework for creating an ownership culture, and a CPA who actually specialized in incentive plans. Now, getting it in front of a diversity of experts, they poked holes in my thinking. They raised questions I hadn't considered. They even pointed me to better resources. And with each conversation, I was able to refine my plan further. And at that point, after talking with those experts, I had a plan that, while it wasn't perfect, it felt good enough to start, enough where I could start taking action. So I met with my partner, I walked him through my thinking, and then I started to do the work I'd laid out in my plan. And the plan continued to evolve. In fact, that plan is still evolving today as I'm taking action. Sometimes it hasn't gone as I've expected, so I try to learn from those situations and revise my plan accordingly. But over time, I've created more and more conviction about the approach as we've made decisions and investments and made commitments along the way. Now, for the woman I spoke with, sharing this story with her and my process helped her move forward. Maybe it will for you too. And one last thing, a while back I interviewed an entrepreneur who had built a $10 million business helping private equity firms find experts. I found his insights so interesting that I worked with him to turn those insights into a simple guide for aspiring owners on how they can find and engage with experts. Because what I find is a lot of people, when I share this process with them, they really get stuck on that pressure tested if they don't feel like they have some stable of experts in their network. So if that's a place you're feeling stuck and you're letting out a dramatic sigh when I went through it, don't fret. I've got a guide. I'll drop it in the description with a link. As always, if you found this video useful, please like it, share it with someone you think it could help. And please, don't quit your daydream. Cheers, y'all.